Hey, bio team. So if a biologist wants to determine the genotypes of an organism, they can do something called crosses, which is just them intentionally mating organisms together in order to determine how they inherit their traits. So for example, let's say biologists wanted to determine whether brown and blue-eyed traits in dogs were dominant or recessive. They might do a cross between two parent dogs, a brown-eyed and a blue-eyed dog, in a parental cross. And let's say that the results of that cross showed that all of their puppies had brown eyes. Well, first of all, we'd call these puppies, the resulting offspring of a parental cross, we'd call that a filial generation, often abbreviated just to an F1 generation. The word filial just means offspring. Well, in this case, the fact that all of the filial generation had brown eyes would suggest that the brown allele in dogs is dominant to the blue-eyed allele. And it would suggest that because if this were the case, these offspring then, this F1 generation, would have received a heterozygous genotype. That is, they would have received a brown allele from one parent and a blue allele from the other parent, but they'd only be expressing the brown allele, which suggests that the brown allele is dominant. However, if we wanted to test this further, we could actually take puppies from the F1 generation and we could cross them together to form an F2 generation. And so if we were to do this, we would predict that our two parents now, these two brown-eyed puppies, are both heterozygous. And so we'd further predict that approximately 3/4 of their offspring would also exhibit the dominant trait, whereas 1/4 of their offspring would receive only recessive alleles and be blue-eyed. So if we were to actually conduct this cross between two of our F1 generation, and the F2 generation turned out to have 11 brown-eyed and 3 blue-eyed puppies, the approximate 3-to-1 ratio would support our proposed method of inheritance. That is, it would support the idea that the brown-eyed allele is dominant to the blue-eyed allele. Now, once you establish which alleles are dominant and which alleles are recessive, you can use that fact to uncover even more information. For instance, if you know what's dominant and recessive, you can do something called a test cross. So for an example of this, let's say I hand you a brown-eyed puppy, and I ask you what's its phenotype for eye color. Well, you'd answer that its phenotype is brown eyes. Well, its phenotype is brown eyes. Okay, you can just observe that. That's its physical appearance. But then let's say I asked you what its genotype for eye color is. That is, what genes are causing it to have brown eyes. Well, this is a little bit more difficult. You might reply that the dog is homozygous brown, that is, it has 2 dominant brown alleles. But you might also consider the fact that it could be a heterozygous carrier of a recessive blue allele. That is, it has 1 dominant brown and 1 recessive blue that just isn't being expressed. And if I just handed you the puppy, you wouldn't know. It could be either of these two. And so in order to determine and narrow down the genotype of the dog, you could perform a test cross. And to do a test cross, you would actually mate our brown-eyed puppy with a blue-eyed puppy. And the reason you do that is because we know from the last slide that a blue-eyed puppy is recessive. And blue-eyed is recessive to brown eyes. And so a blue-eyed puppy must only have recessive alleles, because if it had a dominant brown allele, then it would have had brown eyes. So we can set up hypothetical crosses between a blue-eyed puppy and our mystery brown-eyed puppy. We know that if the mystery brown-eyed puppy is pure dominant, that is, it's homozygous for a brown allele, then all of its offspring would also be brown-eyed. Whereas if the brown-eyed puppy is heterozygous, then we know only approximately half of its offspring will be brown-eyed, and the other half of its offspring would be blue-eyed. And that's it. At this point, you guys have some practice problems. We'll see you next class.